Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Frederick sat in the investigator's office, staring sullenly at the floor. A middle-aged woman in uniform watched the man and waited patiently for the visitor to speak. However, Frederick was in no hurry to say anything. Investigator Aurora waited a couple more minutes and said, "If we play silence with you, I can't help you. You realize that you are not just sitting in my office right now. You are the first suspect in the death of your last wife. And right now you're telling me some kind of curse that I don't believe in. Let's just get to the point. But I'm actually telling you I'm cursed. You already know that I'm considered a black widower in the village. I recently buried my fifth wife, and do you think that's normal?" The man frowned and looked at Aurora. "Yes, I've heard of it. The black widower. But let's exclude mysticism now, and you tell me more about the death of the spouse. But let us agree at once that you will tell me sincerely and without concealing anything. Only in this way I will be able to help you." Frederick looked tiredly at the investigator. The man was silent for some time. He was thinking where he should begin his story. After a few minutes, the visitor looked at the uniformed woman again and then began to speak. Frederick was born in the village, and here he met his first love. It happened purely by chance. A woman and her 2 children came to live with them in the village. They were twin girls who were 18 years old. Mickey himself at that time just turned 21 years old. The guy immediately fell in love with one of the sisters. The girl's name was Sarah and her sister Mary. Frederick began to zealously court his beloved. He tried as often as possible to get in the girl's eyes. Sarah perfectly saw that the guy is in love with her. She liked this young man, and when Mickey proposed marriage to the girl, she agreed to become his wife. Sarah was happy that soon she would create a family, but her sister did not welcome the rapid union of young people. About this, the guy learned about it himself from Maria, when a conversation took place between them. The girl said to the man, "Sarah is not your match. You will be cold to each other in a couple of months. You'd better stay away from her. I don't know what you see in her that you're so obsessed with her. I love your sister, as they say. My heart's in the right place. And what makes you think that we will soon grow cold to each other?" said the boy, bewildered. "Sarah is a simple girl, and as a sister I can see it better. You don't know her very well, but you are a man of prominence and you do not need such a woman," said Maria. "I wonder what I need. Maybe you're referring to yourself." With a smile, said Frederick. "I'm not insinuating. I'm telling it like it is. Can't you see how I feel about you? My mother even told me that I am more suitable for you as a wife than Sarah," she said coquettishly. "Maria, you will find someone else to marry, but my heart belongs to your sister." "I beg you not to talk to me like that again," said the young man seriously. "You will not be happy. Remember my words," said Maria quietly. Soon Frederick married Sarah. The young people rented a small house. The newlyweds wanted to start living from the first days of the wedding on their own. If before the marriage Sarah still wanted to go to study in the city, then as soon as she became Frederick's wife changed her mind. She did not want to leave her loved one for a long time, so she got a job as a salesman in a vegetable stand. The spouses were happy and enjoyed every day. Sarah has repeatedly hinted to her husband that she wants to have a child. Frederick laughed at this suggestion and replied that he was only in favor of becoming a father of a baby in the near future. A year passed after the wedding, and then disaster struck. Sarah, who liked to pick mushrooms in the summer, went to the forest. Frederick was working that day and knew that his spouse loved to go to nature for gifts of nature. The man himself was not a fan of this business, so he did not object. When Frederick came home from work, he found that his wife was still not there. The man became visibly nervous since usually Sarah went to the forest for no more than 4 hours. The young man constantly went out of the house to see his spouse, but everything was in vain. Soon it became dark. Frederick had already run to his mother-in-law. He thought that perhaps his wife went to his mother to talk. However, Sarah did not visit her mother that day. The man is not on a joke worried. He went to the police officer at home, but he waved him off and said that most likely the wife found a halal and is now at his place. He also offered to come back in 3 days if Sarah did not show up. Frederick the next day did not go to work. He ran to his acquaintances to find out anything about his wife. However, no one could not say anything, and in response, they only spread their hands. Sarah was found 2 days later by local fishermen in the river. The girl fell from a rotten bridge into the water and banged her head on a rock, from which she lost consciousness. Here Frederick paused and looked at the investigator. Aurora was making notes in her notebook. The uniformed woman was distracted and asked the man, "Was there a case opened about the death of your spouse?" That's what they said right off the bat, that it was an accident. Sarah stepped on a rotten plank, then lost her balance and fell into the river. She hit her head on a sharp rock, the man said quietly. "Good. Let's continue further. What happened to your second wife?" "And please be thorough," Aurora said. "As you say," the visitor said and continued his story. "After the accident, there was a funeral. Frederick was genuinely saddened by the loss of his beloved. He could not believe that he would never again be able to hug Sarah and tell her that he loved her. As time moved on, Frederick was often visited by the sister of the deceased. She did it unobtrusively, trying to find a suitable excuse to check on the widower. Maria would bring pies to treat the man or ask for help in fixing the house's shaky fence. Mickey perfectly understood that the girl came by deliberately, since she was still in love with him. However, the young man himself felt nothing for Mary, so one day he told her, "You would be better for yourself to look for another guy instead of trying to seduce me. Don't waste your time." "But Sarah is gone. What's stopping you from at least trying to build a relationship with me?" said the girl. "Don't, Maria. I can't live with a man if I don't love him. And in this case, I do not feel anything for you," said the man firmly. "Well, and live a beer you come one." After Sarah's funeral, 2 years passed, and Frederick left for a while to earn money in the city. The man wanted to change the situation, as he was reminded of his late wife. Moving to the city, Mickey got a job at a construction site as a laborer, rented a room, and soon the man met a young woman whose name was Barbara. Between them began a relationship. Frederick realized that the girl became dear to him, and he offered Barbara to formalize the relationship. The young woman responded with consent, and the couple soon signed. Mickey offered his chosen one to move to his village. Barbara realized that in the city they spent a lot of money for a rented room, and their earnings are small. The girl could not bring her husband to her, since she lived in a 2-room apartment with her parents and then her younger sister, so she accepted the proposal of her spouse. The couple moved to live in the village, where they settled with her husband's parents in a private house. Barbara got a job as an accountant in the store. The newlyweds lived soul to soul, and there were no conflicts between them. Neighbors at the sight of the young family often said afterwards that this couple was made for each other. Frederick was glad that now he has a favorite woman. The man often told his wife that fate did not bring him to the city for nothing. The wife, when she heard this, she answered the chosen one, "You and I are both lucky that on that day I was asked to give you your paycheck instead of the cashier. Otherwise we wouldn't have met, and you'd have been working on that construction site for a long time without knowing about me. You're right as always. So I got not only a beautiful wife, but also a wise woman. And let all the men of our village envy me that you are only mine," the man said affectionately in response. The idyll of this couple did not last long. Exactly 6 months later, the woman was returning home after a day of work. She was walking along a country road, which she did not particularly like, as it was always not crowded. And then someone attacked attacked Barbara and hit her on the head with a heavy object. It turned out to be a boulder. The woman was found by a passerby who called an ambulance. However, Barbara could not be saved, and she died without regaining consciousness. Frederick was informed about this by a doctor from the district hospital, who asked the man to come and identify the body. Mickey, when he heard about it over the phone, initially refused to believe it. It was only at the morgue that the man realized it had actually happened. He looked at the breathless body of his wife and mentally cursed fate because, again, he lost his beloved, with whom he had not even lived together for a year. And then there was an investigation, but they could not find the villain because there were no witnesses. Frederick sincerely wanted to track down the villain who committed such an act. The man just wanted to look this man in the eyes and find out what his spouse had done to do to her in such a way. Frederick paused again in his narration. The man lowered his head low and sighed heavily. The investigator saw that his memories were not coming easily and offered him a glass of water. Frederick thanked Aurora and asked if he could continue. The woman in uniform said, "Say, but at least there were some suspects. I've seen the case, but I'd like to hear from you. Did your wife have any enemies? Try to remember. It's important." "No, she was a very sweet and friendly woman. They also say that she wouldn't hurt a fly," the man said in a muffled voice. "Good. Then let's continue. What happened to your third wife?" "As far as I know, she was killed in a traffic accident," Aurora said. Frederick rubbed the bridge of his nose nervously with his right hand and said, "That's what happened. My third wife's name was Julianne. I met her at a hayride 4 years after Barbara's death. I liked the young woman very much for her cheerful disposition. She lived in the neighboring village where I went to mow hay. Initially, we just talked, joked at each other, nothing serious. Soon the haymaking was over and I began to realize that I missed Juliana, her gushing laughter and radiant smile. I can't say that I fell in love with this woman, but I was drawn to her unbearably. So one day, I decided to visit her. She greeted me friendly and said she was glad to see me. I did not beat around the bush, but honestly admitted that I missed her companionship and suggested that we try to live together. Julianne agreed and soon came to live with me. I can't say that everything worked out perfectly for us. There were some minor spats, but they were nothing. Julianne and I lived 2 years after her mother got sick. In that time, we'd already gotten married. So when her mother got sick, Julianne told me she was going to move in with her. I couldn't say no to my wife, so my wife went to the bus stop. That was the last conversation we had with her as she was hit by a car. Julianne was crossing the road, and there was a drunk driver in a white foreign car. I don't think there's any point in going on. All I can say is that when I heard about the tragedy, I thought I was going to lose my mind. My mother, God rest her soul, told me that I was cursed. Frederick was silent. He could say nothing more at the moment. Aurora realized that, so she did not hurry the man. The woman realized that now, at this moment, this man was reliving the moments of those tragic events. However, Frederick raised his head and said unexpectedly, "And you know about the fact that I am cursed, I was told, and Maria, the sister of the first wife. That's very interesting. Tell me about it," said the investigator. The man coughed and began to say that after the funeral of the third wife, he met Maria on the street. The girl uttered words of sympathy and said coldly, "You have only yourself to blame for your sorrows. You have brought on yourself the misfortune that with you, every woman sooner or later dies. I guess it's your destiny to live alone. I told you once that you shouldn't have pushed me away. You sympathize with me well. You're so kind. Why do you still live alone without a man? Haven't you liked any man so far? Okay, I do not want to fight with you. We have not talked for so long, and now I do not see a reason to continue to communicate in such a tone," said the man. "That I live alone is none of your business. So I'm waiting for my lover, who can't see further than his nose," Maria said. "If you wait all the time, you can grow old, But it's your life and you know best, she said. Frederick paused for a moment and then continued speaking. He said that after that conversation with Maria, he really thought that he had been cursed. The man was uncomfortable talking about this topic of mysticism with anyone. And he decided that if he was going to talk to anyone about curses and such, it would be his mother, so he turned to her. You told me once that I was cursed. Do you really believe that? Yes. You've been married 3 times and every time you bury your wives. Don't you think that's strange? If I were you, I'd go to my grandmother in the next village. There is a witch doctor there who is good at fortune telling and predicting the future, though she charges a lot of money for it. But when it comes to their own fate, it is not offensive for this and outstehen yet. You listen to your mother, son. She will not advise badly, said the old woman. I am somehow ashamed that I will go to a fortune teller like a grown-up man, but I will go to women. Maybe you'll do it for me. Well, take there a lock of my hair or a thing, whatever, and go to this fortune teller, and she will tell you there, said Frederick with embarrassment in his voice. What else do you have in mind? I already know my fate. I have lived my life, but you have to go and find out everything yourself, said the old woman admonishingly. All right, I'll do it this weekend, the son said doomedly, not really believing that the witch would answer or help him. On Sunday afternoon, Frederick actually got on the bus and went to the neighboring village. He quickly found the house of a grandmother who lived on the outskirts. The man thought for a few minutes before knocking on the door. He didn't know what he expected from this meeting in general. And then Frederick put aside his doubts and knocked decisively. The door opened after a while, and an old woman appeared on the threshold, holding a cat in her hands. The grandmother looked sternly at the uninvited guest and said in a squeaky voice, "Who are you and what do you want?" The man was embarrassed by such an unfriendly reception and embarrassedly said that he wanted to know what was going on in his life. And then he hurriedly told about the death of 3 spouses. The grandmother, who was called Biti, invited the visitor with a gesture into the house and said, "Now hold the deck in your hands, warm the cards with your breath, and I will see what happened to you, why you are constantly haunted by tragic situations with your wives." After that, the old woman took out a shabby deck of cards and handed it to Frederick. The man complied with the request of the lady of the house, and then watched as the old woman skillfully laid out the cards, and at the same time muttering something. Frederick tried to understand what the old woman was saying, but could not. The old woman looked at the cards for a few moments and then said, "There is a curse on you, my dear. Some sweetheart has fallen for you and does not want to give you to anyone. It is necessary to remove the curse or you will bury another wife. This rite is strong and will require a lot of strength and health from me. But you're not a little boy, and you know where I'm going with this. The reward for the ritual you must give with desire, and never regret it if you do otherwise. The evil will return to you in an instant. I hear you, Betty. Don't worry, the money is there, and since I'm already here, I'm ready to do everything consciously, including rewarding you for your labor," the man said. Frederick only wanted to continue telling the investigator the story, as Aurora interrupted him. "And I understand you gave this charlatan a sum of money, and she, in turn, performed the ritual. Let us not bring up the topic of witchcraft. I do not really care about it, as such experts in the field of esotericism do not particularly welcome. So please, let's move on to the death of the 4th wife. As you say, but there is a great deal of mysticism in my story," said the visitor. Frederick looked at the glass of water and asked for permission to drink. Aurora slid the mug over and nodded. The man took a few sips, twirled the empty glass in his hand, and only then began to speak again. Mickey met his 4th wife, Victoria, a couple years after his 3rd wife died. The man had just buried his mother and came the next day to visit the deceased, as he saw the lonely figure of a young woman in a black scarf, standing in the cemetery near the grave. The stranger was saying something quietly and furtively, wiping away her tears with a handkerchief. Frederick saw the woman take candy from her purse and put it carefully on a mound of earth. And then she said something and went out of the cemetery. The man did not hesitate to follow the stranger. Almost near the exit from the cemetery, caught up with the woman and softly said, addressing her, "I'm sorry for God's sake that I'm disturbing you, but may I ask you, who have you recently lost? You asked for permission, and yet you've already asked a question." "I buried my mother. She lived in this village," the woman said softly. "I must have forgotten how to talk to the fairer sex. I'm sorry for your loss. I too just buried my mother and was left alone like a buryuk in this world. And you know, honestly, it's so hard right now," Frederick said quietly. "Are you asking me to talk to you?" the stranger said, perplexed. "I realize that a cemetery is not the best place to meet, but since you and I have already spoken, and both of us have recently lost people dear to us, maybe we should talk a little," the man said. "You're an interesting guy. All the men here must be so interesting. I'm not from around here, and my mom came here like a year ago. Let's walk and talk," the young woman said. The couple walked along the country road toward the bus stop. After a while, the man knew the name of the woman, that she was 26 years old, married, divorced 2 years ago when her child died, lives at the present time in the city, and is about to sell a house in the village. She works in a beauty parlor as a hairdresser. The man honestly admitted to Victoria that he had 3 spouses in his life, and all of them died. The new acquaintance, as soon as she heard this, she involuntarily said, "Apparently you cannot be contacted, or you will suffer the same fate as your other halves. You won't believe it, but I'm afraid to date anyone myself now. I've had enough of being called a black widower in public," the interlocutor replied glumly. And then the man told the investigator that he exchanged phone numbers with Victoria. And after that he often called the young woman. However, after 10 days, the girl reported that there was a buyer for the house and she was going to leave. Frederick was upset by this news. He did not want Victoria to leave the village. In his heart, he hoped that he would be able to start a family with her. Before leaving, the man confessed his love to the girl, but she looked at him fearfully after these words and said that nothing could be between them. Frederick didn't expect such a reaction and asked, "Is it because I'm considered a black widower? I was talking to a woman here recently. Her name is Maria, and she told me that you are to blame for the deaths of your wives," Victoria said. Frederick immediately realized who could say that about him. The man began to explain confusedly that he was not guilty of anything. However, Victoria did not want to even hear anything about it. The woman really believed that Mickey was involved in the deaths of his wives. Victoria soon left, and the man went to deal with his first wife's twin sister. Frederick angrily accused the woman of lying, and Mary only smiled achidically in response. The man looked contemptuously at the woman and left in silence. Frederick, after Victoria's departure, often called her and wrote loving text messages. Such communication between them continued for about a month, and Frederick was able to persuade the woman to come to him for a while. As soon as Victoria arrived in the village, then the man asked the beloved not to listen to anyone else and believe only him. The woman stayed with Frederick for 10 days and again went to the city. The couple began to communicate again on the phone, and after a while Victoria reported her pregnancy. The man the very next day went to the chosen one and made her an offer. After a while, they signed and Victoria moved to live with her husband in the village. Frederick insisted that his wife stayed at home, and she agreed. Victoria gladly plunged into the daily chores of the household. She cooked meals, fiddled in the vegetable garden, went to the store for groceries. However, the husband noticed that the closer the time to childbirth, the more restless the woman becomes. He initially attributed this circumstance to the fact that Victoria fears the upcoming labor. He decided to talk about this topic with his wife, and as soon as the man asked his wife about the cause of anxiety, the wife hysterically shouted, "I want to leave here. Something bad is bound to happen here. Where do you get this nonsense from? After all, before we had everything was fine, so why should bad things happen?" Perplexed, said the husband, who really did not understand the nervousness of his wife. "Perdition walks beside you," Victoria shouted hysterically. "Calm down and tell everything in order." "There is no such thing as anxiety in an empty place," the man said firmly. However, the woman refused to speak on the subject, and due to the fact that Victoria was recently in nervous tension, she went to the hospital and prematurely gave birth to a boy who lived only a few hours. Here Frederick paused and swallowed convulsively the lump that stood in his throat. Aurora at the same moment filled a glass with water and held it out to her visitor. The man nervously took a few sips and put the glass on the table, and then said, "After that, my wife was discharged, but she seemed obsessed and kept saying that I was to blame for the fact that our son could not survive. But it wasn't. The baby had a weak heart, and it wasn't my fault. I tried to explain all this to my wife, but Victoria only kept saying one thing, that I was sowing destruction. And a few days before my wife died, I found out that while I was at work, Maria visited us. I was informed of this by our neighbor. I naturally wanted to talk to Maria. I wanted to know what she wanted from my wife, but she didn't tell me anything sensible." Aurora looked at the man carefully and then made some notes in her notebook. And softly after that she said, "And now I will ask you to remember the day when your spouse was gone. Start from the morning, what mood your wife was in, what she wanted to do that day, who visited her. You are now required to answer all my questions as accurately as possible. What do you want me to tell you?" When I got ready for work, Victoria got up and went to put the kettle on in the kitchen. She didn't say a word to me, although I wished her a good morning. I then went over to give her a kiss before I left. I always do that when I go to work. But Victoria didn't let me near her. I thought then that I would have another unpleasant conversation in the evening. And after that, I left. I don't know who came, and I didn't ask anyone. But in the evening, I came, and soon I got a call that my wife had thrown herself under the car. There was an investigation, but the driver wasn't at fault. And then another funeral. And as a consequence, some acquaintances began to shun me. I lived in the village for a while, and then I couldn't stand it, and like the last coward, ran away from there to the city. I was just tired of seeing people looking at me with condemnation, as if I had brought Victoria to this act. In fact, I tried to support my wife after giving birth. I even offered to go to a psychologist, but she refused. I still can't understand why my wife did that, because together we could overcome everything. Now I understand that you want to hear a story about the last wife, where I am considered a criminal who ruined his own wife. Am I right? Let's not be so immediately harsh in our phrases. In this case, you're a suspect at large, nothing more. I'm here with you for a reason. You understand that we have to get to the bottom of this so you don't end up in jail. That's why you need to tell me exactly what happened that day, but please be more specific. I understand that it is hard for you to remember everything, but I ask you to gather yourself and continue your story," said Aurora. Frederick covered his head with both hands and moaned softly after the investigator's words. The man felt that the last story would be especially hard for him. He lowered his hands and clenched them into fists. Then he looked at his interlocutor with a sad look and began his narrative. The man said again that when Victoria was gone, he had gone to the city. He rented a place there and got a job back at the construction site. He saw some of the women at work, trying to seduce him, but he decided for himself that no more relationships. Frederick could not get over the fact that the 4 women who had been his spouses, and they were now gone from this world. The man often analyzed his fate and looked for an answer to the question of why he was so unlucky in life. He also often recalled his visit to a fortune teller, and how she told him that if he spared money for the fee for the ritual, all evil would return to him. Frederick asked himself several times if he had spared the money then, and each time he answered himself that he had not. And for the 100th time, he immediately asked himself the question that if he gave the money to the witch with a light heart, then why fate continues to punish him. And when Frederick once again asked himself about it, he realized that he just needed an answer. The man did not think long. On the weekend, went to the seer and asked her a question. "What's going on?" You conducted a rite of removal of spoilage, and I still died then, spouse. And I didn't spare you a fee. Can you explain to me what's going on? I just have doubts that you're a common fraud who makes a living this way. You come here for an answer, and you start berating me. It's not right to do that, especially since I'm old enough to be your mother, the old woman said sternly. Don't hide behind your age now. My whole life is going wrong. Tell me honestly that your ritual is a mere fiction. If you answer honestly, I will not hold a grudge against you, the man said in a muffled voice. Give me your palm and I'll tell you what's ahead of you, the old woman said. The man stretched out his hand and watched the witch scrutinize the palm. And then she said that he needed to cleanse his soul before the Lord, and then everything would be all right. After the old woman added that if he did not do it, he would have to wait for more grief. The man barely restrained himself at that moment not to spit on the floor out of frustration. Frederick left the seer in a bad mood. He, at that moment, believed that he got the most real charlatan, who will easily lie and not blink an eye. A couple of years passed. The man in every way avoided any relationship with the female sex. Friends at work, who did not know about his fate, joked at him. Friends could not understand how a man in the dawn of life and so zealously avoids contact with the ladies, and Frederick continued only to work, and in the evenings to pass the leisure reading e-books, occasionally going to the social network. That's where the man met Julia, who was 10 years younger than him. Frederick began the most innocent communication. He did not even see the girl's photo. He just liked to correspond with her and sometimes call. The young woman lived in a neighboring town and always communicated with the man in a friendly manner, and Frederick could not stand it and told about his fate and that he put a huge cross on his personal life. As soon as this, the girl heard on the phone, then laughed assiduously. It was this laughter that further attracted the man's attention to the interlocutor, and he suddenly said, "And let's meet you in real life. I want to see you in person. How do you like my proposal?" Unexpected, to be honest. "But why after 3 months of communication you decided to offer it?" the girl asked. "I heard your laughter. It is so infectious. By the way, why did you laugh when I said that I put a fat cross?" said the man. "Because it was said stupidly. You're imagining all sorts of nonsense. Everything will turn out in your life, and you will definitely meet the only one with whom you will live until your old age. And as they say, you will die with her on the same day," she said in a cheerful voice. "If you think so, don't refuse to meet me. Let's meet on neutral territory. I promise I won't bother you. You know, I need this meeting. I cannot explain it to you, but I really need to see you," said Frederick quietly. "You're very persuasive. And how do you envision it? We live in different cities, and I live with my parents, so I can't invite you to visit," she said. "I'll take some time off and come to you. I'll rent a room for a couple of days. But don't think that for carnal pleasures. I just need to sleep somewhere. And you'll give me a tour of the city in the afternoon and tell me about your sights. I believe that you will make a wonderful guide because you are an excellent conversationalist," said the man. The girl did not hesitate and agreed. Frederick promised to tell the young woman one day when he would be able to come. Julia, in turn, said that before the day of arrival will try as thoroughly as possible to prepare a review of the sights. This statement from the interlocutor involuntarily caused the man to smile, and he suddenly realized that now he smiled more and more often when he heard the girl's voice. Sometime later, the man arrived in the city to Julia. She herself met him from the train. As soon as Frederick saw the young woman, he instantly realized that now his heart was broken forever. The man involuntarily scolded himself mentally for speaking in high-pitched words, but aloud said quite the opposite. He handed the girl the flowers and said, "You are even more beautiful than I imagined you to be. How could you imagine me if you've never even seen a picture of me?" Julia laughed. "I don't know, but I'm telling you frankly now, without any exaggeration. I don't even understand why such a beautiful girl without a boyfriend. Tell me what's the catch?" said in all seriousness, Frederick, just as not met yet, apparently a man. Something we began to talk about two serious topics. If you are not tired from the road, you can walk a little, and then you will need to find a room for the night, she said briskly. Frederick had spent 3 days in the city, and the couple had been together from morning to evening. The girl also took some time off. She worked as a dispatcher in a cab. The man and the woman found a lot of topics for communication they could discuss, as well as soccer and the life of famous people. And when the day of departure came, Frederick said timidly, "You know, I've been married many times, but this is the first time I feel this way. I'm not saying that I didn't love my wives. It wouldn't be nice of me to say that. But you know, what is happening to me now? I do not understand. I did not have such attraction before. I want to hear your voice just to admire you. You are for me now as an embodiment of something unearthly. How pompous you are," she said, and only wanted to laugh when she saw the man's serious gaze. Julia faltered and suddenly blushed, and at the same moment Frederick embraced her and kissed her passionately on the lips. The girl did not push the man away, but only pressed herself more tightly against him. Frederick, before getting into the carriage, took Julia's word that she would soon come to him. The young woman looked absent-mindedly at her interlocutor and promised that as soon as she could, she would definitely come to visit. After the breakup, a month passed, and the couple still called every day and communicated in the social network. The man told how he had a day and necessarily added that he misses the girl very much, and Julia, in turn, reported about his news and confusedly admitted that he also dreams of a quick meeting. And then the young woman said that she was on vacation and was going to come to visit. Frederick was overjoyed by this news and planned what he would entertain his beloved. He wanted to arrange something unusual in honor of the arrival of a young woman. Frederick went through many options, how you can surprise your loved one. But the mind came to banal things. And then the man decided that since he did not have a rich imagination, he would simply take Julia for a ride on the river on a motorboat, which can be rented for a few hours. He did not know at that moment whether the girl would like such a plot, but still settled on this option. And so Julia arrived in the city, where she was met by Frederick with a huge bouquet of flowers. The man hugged the girl and said that he had a surprise. The girl looked at her interlocutor with amazement and asked, "I hope that this is not an invitation to a horror movie?" "How silly. Even I would not have thought of such a thing. I want to go for a motorboat ride on the river with you. That's one of the little surprises, and the rest as we go along," said Frederick, who at the moment wanted only one thing: to embrace the young woman and never let her out of his arms. The couple were soon seated in the boat. The man steered the boat to the middle of the river and turned off the motor. The girl looked at her companion in surprise and laughingly asked, "Now will follow, I take it, another surprise. I hope I will not be in the role of moo moo. What nonsense you have in your head from the road. I want you to know that I'm so happy to see you. And here, where you and I are now in solitude, I propose that you become my wife, and that you and I, as you told me earlier, would live to a ripe old age and die on the same day." Frederick said softly, and with these words held out a red velvet box, which contained a gold wedding ring. "You are the most charming man, and I agree with you," said the girl quietly, taking the thin gold ring from the hands of her companion. After a walk along the river, the couple arrived at Frederick's rented room, where the young woman immediately found herself in the arms of a man. And then they made love, and after the couple began to make plans for a joint family life. When the conversation reached the registry office, the man involuntarily wrinkled his nose and said to Julie, "I offered you to become my lawful wedded wife, but I have, somewhere in the depths of my soul, there is a fear that I can lose you. Maybe we'll live in a civil marriage. I'll be calmer that way. Or maybe that which is right, and I really should go to church. You just proposed, and now you're like a cowardly bunny in the bushes. No, I'll only be a lawful wedded wife and no other way. And forget your prejudices. Your witch is a common swindler and she's going to jail. I don't believe in magic, witchcraft, and the like, the young woman said with a smile. After a while, the couple legalized their relationship and lived in Frederick's rented room. Julia got a new job as a dispatcher. The newlyweds enjoyed every moment of the day. Frederick occasionally visited the village to check on his parents' house, and on another trip he met Maria. The man said hello coldly. He didn't want to talk to Sarah's sister. The young woman, on the contrary, was happy to meet him and said casually, "You've forgotten us here with your new wife." "How do you know about Julia?" perplexed asked the man, who really did not understand how Maria could know about his marriage if she lived in the village and he in the city. The young woman laughed coquettishly in response and said, "Did you think that you had gone to another place of residence and some personalities had forgotten about you? You are fundamentally wrong, my dear. Did you call yourself a personality? Although I believe it because I always considered myself higher than others and even cooler than my late sister. And I am also not dear to you," said the man gloomily, and went on his way without waiting for an answer from the interlocutor. At that moment, Frederick's investigator, Aurora, asked a question. How did Maria know about his marriage to Julia? The man looked at the uniformed woman in incomprehension and only waved his hands in response. The investigator looked thoughtfully at the visitor, made some notes, and asked him to continue the story. Frederick nodded in agreement, but continued to remain silent. After a few minutes, the man said that Aurora's question had confused him and now he couldn't rest. The investigator asked him to focus on the rest of the story, adding that they would return to the matter, and Frederick looked down at the floor and continued the story. The man said that he and Julia had been living together for a year when the wife began to complain that she couldn't get pregnant. The husband tried to reassure his wife that it was not yet time for Julia to become a mother. The young woman did not argue about it this time, but she started a conversation on the subject a couple of months later. The spouse said, "You know, I was talking to my mother on the phone, and she asked me when I would make her happy and make her a grandmother. I honestly told her that we're not getting anywhere in that regard. Understand, I cannot lie to my mother, so I had to put it all out in the open. And what could I do in this case? I don't mind that you and your mom are being honest, but where are you going with this?" My husband said. "My mother advised me to go to your village for a month just to relax. And you know, I think she's right because you have clean country air and just did not prevent a break from the bustle of the city," said the young woman thoughtfully, and then added, "Agree, it's just for a while." Frederick looked at his wife with an affectionate gaze. He could not refuse her when the chosen one asked him for something. The man wanted to say that he agreed, as he was aware of the tragedies that had happened to his wives in the village and its surroundings. And he voiced his thought to Julia, who heard it and exclaimed, "You're at it again. Let's not talk about the irreparable happening. Don't be pessimistic. I know you're not. I promise you that I will live to old age, and you and I will still see great grandchildren, but only if we go to the village." Frederick could not refuse after this phrase to his wife. And after a while, the couple arrived in the village. Julia happily inhaled the air and said that she particularly liked it here. The husband looked at this moment at his wife and thought that he could really stay here if his wife wants to live here. The couple had been living in the village for a week, and Frederick needed to go to town. The man asked his wife not to be bored during his absence and added that he would be away for only a couple of days. Julia laughed in response and gently cooed that she would find something to do while her husband was away. When the man arrived from the city, the young woman happily hugged her spouse and asked how the trip had been. Frederick replied that everything had been wonderful and he had settled his affairs. And then her husband asked what Julia was doing in his absence. The girl enthusiastically pointed out how she had rearranged the bedroom. The husband said with surprise, "And how did you move this bed alone? It's massive, and you're my fragile." "Oh, I forgot to tell you that I went to the store and met a woman. She knows you, by the way. Her name is Maria. We had a heart." to Heart Talk, and she helped me with the rearrangement. This woman is a wonderful person. I invited her to come to our house today, and I think it will be nice for you to see an old acquaintance, Julia said happily, and immediately noticed her husband's frown. The woman looked at her husband perplexed and asked a question. What's the matter? I would like you not to talk to Maria. She is not a person to be friends with, Frederick said glumly. Do you want us to live separately? But I don't like that. Maria is a very nice woman, and we get along very well, she said resentfully. The woman probably forgot to tell you that I was married to her sister, the man said. But that doesn't mean anything. What was? Should the tragedy that happened to your spouse be a reason for not communicating? But that's nonsense. It's hard for me to understand you at the moment, said the wife. The man did not answer Julia, but embraced her and kissed her on the lips. He did not want to spoil the mood of his wife and himself on the day of his arrival. Friedrich decided that as soon as Maria arrived, he would ask her not to impose her communication on his wife anymore. However, the conversation between the man and his guest did not work out since Julia was around all the time, and in front of his wife he did not want to talk to Maria. Another week passed, during which time Maria came to visit only once, which pleased Frederick. Yes, and Julia didn't think much of her new acquaintance anymore. And so the man decided that it was better to leave the conversation with Maria, especially since they had to leave for the city soon. However, on the eve of departure, Julia turned to her husband with a request. Come on, let's move here to live. I will be engaged in the vegetable garden, try to get a job. Do not think that I am such an inept. In addition to the dispatcher worked as a salesman, and one more plus one, that Mom and her sister can come to us here, and they have a place to stay. And in the city, you and I were living in a one-bedroom apartment, and my family had no place to stay. For Frederick, this proposal was unexpected, and he thought about it. On the one hand, Julia gave strong arguments to stay in the village, but on the other hand, something stopped him from this decision. The man replied to his wife that he should weigh everything first and then make a decision. His wife furrowed her eyebrows and quietly said, "Didn't I give you enough reasons to stay here?" Julia was able to convince her husband to move to the village, but Frederick put forward the condition that the woman would stay at home and do household chores. The landlord would take care of the family. Julia gladly agreed to the demand. The couple settled in the village. Frederick got a job, and the wife began to improve the house. And nothing foreshadowed trouble in this couple. Frederick paused again and discreetly brushed a tear from his eye. Aurora realized that the story was nearing the end and did not rush the man, as she understood how difficult it was for this man to give grief memories, because he now had to relive once again that tragic day when his beloved wife was gone. The man was silent for a while, and then looked at the investigator and said, "I am ready to tell everything further, but I have a big request. While I will speak, then do not ask your questions. Let me tell you everything, and then ask questions." "All right, it's a deal. Please begin," Aurora said softly. "We'd been living in the village for almost 2 months now, and everything was fine. Julia and I couldn't even find a reason to fight. And that day I went to work, as usual, and my wife promised to make the potato pies I like. She was very good at it, by the way. At 6 in the evening I came home and saw my wife holding her stomach and moaning quietly. Her face was white as chalk. I was frightened and jumped up to Julia. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but I didn't have time because she had lost consciousness. I immediately called an ambulance, which, as it turned out, took a long time to arrive. And then the paramedic began to feel the pulse, which was beating very weakly. The medic gave my wife a shot, and she was carried on a stretcher to the car. I also got into the ambulance, as I did not want to leave my beloved woman for a minute. But we did not have time to get to the hospital, as Julia stopped breathing. And after that, everything happened as if in a fog. So like to write in many novels, but I experienced it for real. I had it all flashing before my eyes like a fast-paced movie. Julia was quickly taken to the emergency room and they tried to resuscitate her. But soon the doctor came out and just waved his hand, saying that they had done everything they could. At that moment, I wanted to hit that doctor, as I did not expect that from him. And then, you already know, there was an autopsy, which showed that my wife was poisoned with some kind of poison. Then the investigation, where I became the first suspect. And now I'm sitting in your office and you're interrogating me. But you know, I would never poison my wife because I loved a woman so much for the first time. But what I don't understand is how Julia could have taken the poison herself, because she was cheerful and it wasn't in her nature to pass away. How can it be that now she is no longer in this world? Frederick lowered his head and cried unashamedly. Aurora looked at the man and realized that this man could not be involved in the poisoning of his wife, as he was sincerely grieving at the moment. The investigator did not ask any questions. She waited for Frederick to calm down. In these moments, the woman sincerely sympathized with the man. Some time passed, and as soon as the investigator saw that the man had pulled himself together, she said that now she had a lot more questions. Frederick nodded silently, signaling that he was ready to answer. And then the woman said, "I understand that you are not easy now and sincerely sympathize with you, but I still have to answer you. Tell me, did your wife take any medications?" "No. I told you earlier in the investigation that her health was fine." "Now I can ask questions again, and you try to answer them specifically. So maybe your wife drank sedatives or perhaps homeopathic medicines that you didn't know about," said the investigator. "You ask stupid questions. Has only recently said that my wife was a cheerful woman and loved to live, so why would she take sedatives?" "Okay. Tell me, did you find any suspicious files at home?" Aurora asked another question. "No," the man answered quietly. "And on that tragic day, did anyone visit you?" asked the investigator. "I was at work. How can I answer that question?" Frederick said quietly. The uniformed woman asked a few more questions, taking notes. Aurora said that she had no more questions for the day and reminded the man to keep in touch if possible and to be ready to come to the police if he had any more questions. And afterward, the investigator said that the interview was over for the day and she was no longer detaining Frederick. And before the man left, he said, "When Julia was gone, I believed that the witch from the neighboring village was right after all. She told me that if I didn't go to church, tragedy would strike, and I didn't believe it. And it did. I really have a curse on me, and it's not for nothing that the villagers called me the Black Widower." "We'll figure it out," the investigator replied in a single word. As soon as the visitor left, the woman thought she really had too many questions, but not enough answers. Aurora decided to make another trip to the village and interview the man's neighbors in more detail. And she also still wanted to especially talk to one woman from the village. She had a lot of questions for her. Aurora came home from work with a headache. She couldn't get the whole Julia poisoning thing out of her head. She had a gut feeling that Frederick had nothing to do with it, but she had to prove it. And the woman also remembered the man's whole story, all the tragic events in his life. It was Frederick's narration that kept her in suspense. It was impossible for a man to speak so sincerely about every event, reliving it over and over again. And Aurora also thought that if this one was lying, he was an excellent actor, and she would have to resolve all this in the shortest possible time to find out everything and calm down on it herself. The next day, the investigator drove her car to the village as planned. Aurora knew that it would be a long journey, and she called Frederick to find out where she could stay for a couple of days in the village. The man replied perplexed that he couldn't even answer that question because he didn't know who could rent a room in the village. The woman retorted by saying, "Don't fill your head. I will solve this question on the spot." The investigator reached the village already in the evening. She immediately went to the district police officer and also asked where it was possible to find accommodation here. The man gave the address of an old woman and personally escorted Aurora to the pensioner. The next morning, the investigator went to interview Frederick's neighbors. The woman went first to one neighbor. She turned out to be an elderly pensioner. The conversation with the old lady lasted about an hour, but did not give any results that would help in solving the case. Then Aurora knocked on the neighboring house from Frederick. This time she was opened by a frail brunette woman who was holding an infant in her arms. The woman invited the investigator into the house and looked questioningly at the visitor. The visitor told her what she had come for and asked a question. "You are Frederick's neighbor, and as I see at the moment, a housewife. Can you recall if anyone visited them on the day Julia was taken away in the ambulance? Think carefully before you answer, because this is very important." "I don't recall," the young woman said, then paused and spoke again. "Wait. They had a dog barking. I remember it clearly as I was putting the baby to bed, and the dog's barking was very disturbing to me." "Does dog barking mean something?" the visitor asked in a bewildered tone. "It's obvious that you are not a villager. Our dogs bark only if someone comes from the strangers or people who rarely visit the owners of the house. So that day Frederick's dog barked, and I blurted out that they had a visitor at the wrong hour." "And you didn't look out to see who it was?" asked Aurora, who, like a predator, suddenly felt the excitement, because there was a little thread in the case. "I'm not nosy enough to keep an eye on my neighbor's visitors," the brunette said capriciously. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. It was just very important for me to know. Thank you for answering the questions. And now, with your permission, I'll go," the woman in shoulder straps said, and left the house. Aurora questioned a few more neighbors, but did not get the information she was interested in. There was one man who lived across the street from Frederick, but he was away. The woman sighed disappointedly. She had hoped that maybe this neighbor would have said something useful that would help the investigation. The next day, Aurora planned a trip to see Maria, Sarah's sister, who was the man's first wife. The investigator had a lot of questions for this woman, and she wrote them down in her notebook so she wouldn't miss any. Aurora really hoped that talking to Maria would lift the veil on this confusing case. In the morning, the investigator made her way to the woman's house, but she was at work. Aurora then took the phone number from Mariah's mother and called her. She asked permission to come to Mariah's workplace and ask her some questions. The person on the phone replied that she would not feel comfortable talking because she worked in a store and had a lot of customers. The investigator then said that she would pay a visit this evening to talk to her. Aurora went to Frederick's house to avoid wasting time. He was surprised to see her, and on the doorstep he said, "I know you are in the village. I know you are in the village, but I did not think you would decide to visit me. Do you have questions for me again?" "Yes and no. I just want to say that on that fateful day you had a visitor, but it is only unknown who that person was. Judging by the timing, not long before you arrived. Tell me with whom your wife has been communicating lately." The woman said tensely, "Caroline is our librarian. They became friends shortly after we moved to the village." "She's a good woman, married with 2 children," said the landlord. "And your first wife's sister. As far as I remember, you said you were against their communication. By the way, why didn't you want them to communicate?" the investigator said. "With Barbara." "No, they didn't. At least not that I've seen her around here. And Julia didn't mention her," he said. Aurora asked for the librarian's address and then thanked Frederick. The next visit, the woman paid Caroline a direct visit at work. The investigator asked Julia's friend a question. "You were friends with Frederick's wife. Can you tell me if Julia has said anything unusual to you lately?" "Who told you we were friends with Julia?" "That's nonsense. Our communication was hi and bye. Yes, how are you? All I know is that Julia has been seen lately with Elizabeth. That's the local seductress of men's hearts," Caroline muttered and added, "Elizabeth doesn't exactly have a good reputation in the village. In Russian, she's a night butterfly." "And who told you that I was Julia's friend?" "Frederick. I didn't expect him to say that." "Strange," said the librarian, perplexed. "What's strange?" Aurora asked her question curtly. "That Mickey said we were friends. He knew we weren't really friends," she said. Aurora left the library in a gloomy mood. Frederick had recently deceived her by saying that Julia was friends with Caroline, which was not true. The investigator decided to ask the man a few questions in hot pursuit, and once she was at his house, She sternly asked him why he was misleading her. Here the interlocutor became embarrassed and said, "I was embarrassed to say that Julia began to see Elizabeth often." "That is not a person suitable for socializing? I suppose Caroline has already told you that?" "Exactly. And I was hoping you'd answer my questions honestly. And now you've sown a seed of distrust. And tell me, where else have you deceived me, namely in what points?" Trying not to raise the tone of the woman said, "Everything else is true," said the owner of the house softly. "We'll find out." "I didn't expect that from you," the guest said, not hiding her irritation. As soon as Aurora was in her car, her thoughts swirled in her head. Now she was already thinking differently about the man's innocence. The woman involuntarily suggested, what if Frederick communicates with this Elizabeth and they began a relationship, and Julia somehow kept her spouse, and the man decided that his wife should be dealt with? Aurora shook her head and thought that these were delusional thoughts. First of all, how could Julia keep Frederick near her? And secondly, why would Frederick do such a thing when he already had several dead spouses, and another tragedy was not good for him? The woman felt her head spinning from all her thoughts and forced herself to take her mind off the matter for a few moments. It was only after half an hour that she realized that now she could get back to her work. And to do that, she had to find Elizabeth and then talk to Maria. Finding Elizabeth wasn't difficult, and in 20 minutes, Aurora was already sitting in the living room of the pretty woman. The investigator said, without preamble, what the matter was hereabout. The landlady raised an eyebrow in amazement and said, "Yes, we have been communicating with Julia, and what of it? Do you want to accuse me of coming and poisoning a friend? How absurd. And to put it in your language, what was my motive? To seduce her husband when Julia's gone. That's what you're getting at, isn't it? I'm just asking the questions that interest me. And first, I would like to know what your relationship is to Frederick Valentinovich," said Aurora, and at the same moment she heard her companion laugh loudly. The guest waited a few minutes and again asked her question, to which she immediately received an answer. Elizabeth said, "Don't make me laugh. Slavkamian the Sirat does not tolerate. Even if we go to meet each other on the road, he goes to the other side. Suppose you are telling the truth. And what then you have in common with Julia? Judging by human rumor, you are a free woman and live by your own principles. Namely, you like to meet representatives of the stronger sex. Unlike you, Julia is a faithful wife who loved her husband," Aurora said. "You should ask Julia what attracted her to me. I don't give a damn what people think of me. I hope your questions are over, or I have a suitor coming to see me," Elizabeth said snidely. "Is a man who recently buried his wife rushing to you? Please note that this is not our last conversation with you," sarcastically replied the investigator and hurriedly left the house. Now Aurora had only one person left in her plans for today, and that was Maria. The woman wondered what a conversation with Maria would yield. Aurora hoped that the conversation would bring at least some clarification, so she waited impatiently for the evening. And so the long-awaited hour came, and the investigator knocked at Maria's house. The door was opened by a pensioner. It was the mother of the deceased Sarah and her sister, Ariana. The old woman looked at the guest and grumpily said, "Is it you again? What are you doing out in the middle of the night?" "I want to see your daughter Maria." "Let me pass, because we have a long conversation to have with her, and there may be some questions for you," she said. Ariana reluctantly let Aurora pass, and a pretty woman came out and extended her hand in greeting. The investigator introduced herself again, as she had done on the phone, and shook her hand. In the meantime, Maria invited her into the living room and offered her tea. The guest refused and immediately asked the question, "Tell me, where were you when Julia was poisoned?" "Wow, that's an interesting question, but I'll answer it. I was at home. I had the day off. And I'm suspected of something, Maria asked with a smile. No. What was your relationship with Julia and her husband? Asked Aurora, who did not like the smile of her interlocutor. What a tricky question you have. Julia and I were just acquaintances. We occasionally exchanged a few words when we met. But Frederick, he's my dead sister's husband. We can only be related, she said calmly. But Frederick said that he did not treat you very well. He even forbade his wife to communicate with you. Don't you find it strange that you claim to be related? Try to explain it to me, said the investigator. I don't understand the purpose of your visit. You're investigating a case and you're asking about my relationship with a married man. I can tell you that at one time I liked Frederick, and then it was all in the past, said Maria, who was visibly nervous. The guest noticed it too, and she thought it was strange that such innocent questions would make her confused. Aurora looked at Maria and suddenly asked on a completely different topic. Say, and how did you know that Frederick married in the city to Victoria, as I know you lived at that time in the village? We have a lot of mutual acquaintances with Mickey, and I was told about it. There's nothing wrong with that, Maria said. The investigator asked a few more questions, noting that she was nervous as she answered. Aurora noticed that Maria was afraid of getting into trouble when she answered, which made her think that she was not telling the truth or was lying. And at the end of the conversation, the visitor asked the last question, So you say that you did not visit Julia on that fateful day? I have already told you that I stayed at home all day, and my mother can confirm it, Maria replied stiffly. Let's ask your mother. Can I ask Ariana the question myself? Said the investigator, and with these words rose from her chair to go to the kitchen, where the pensioner was at that time. But immediately, Aurora Anatolievna was blocked by Maria, who said, Don't bother Mom, she's lying down. She has high blood pressure today. Why are you lying to me? Ariana is in that room over there, and I can tell by the aroma that your mother is preparing a family dinner. Don't worry. I'll ask an innocent question, the visitor said, and gestured to Maria, then walked into the kitchen where she saw the lady of the house. The visitor stood up so that she could see both Maria and Ariana, and only then asked a question. I'm sorry to interrupt you from your busy work, but I need to ask you a question. Tell me, your daughter was at home all day on September 24th. Did she still have the day off? Wait, I don't even remember. The pensioner said, perplexed, and looked at her daughter. Aurora also at this moment looked at the face of Maria, who stood and nervously rubbed the end of her lettuce blouse. The investigator went on the sly and asked the older woman the following question. Yes, you must remember. Maria wanted to go to a friend's house. She promised her something. Oh yes, that's right. But to whom I don't know how and what to take, Ariana muttered, and then nervously Maria herself intervened in the dialogue, who irritably muttered, Mom, you... Something is confusing. I've been sitting at home all day. Aurora at this point smiled and asked Maria not to be nervous. The investigator already realized that her interlocutor was lying to her, so she spoke calmly. Maria, you react so violently to simple questions that it seems a little strange to me. If you said that you were at home, then it is so, and your mother could simply forget the day. You might want to take a sedative to calm your nerves. Yes, she has those drops, but she doesn't drink them, and she spent so much money on them, Ariana said grumpily. At the same second, the investigator tensed up and asked to see the vial with the medicine. However, the pensioner said that her daughter had given the medicine to an acquaintance. Aurora asked the owner of the house, and to whom Maria gave the sedative drops, but in response the elderly woman only waved her hands. The guest looked at Maria, who looked mockingly at the visitor. Aurora had already asked Maria this question, and she grinned in response and said, The medicine was expired, and she poured them out, and Mom, something about the buddy and the overpriced sedative drops. Ariana looked at her daughter with an incomprehensible look, but did not object, as she realized that the conversation was on a topic where she should not interfere. Aurora realized that there was no point in talking further and said quietly, I have gotten answers to all my questions. And now you, Maria, can be calm, because on that fateful day we're at home, and you have nothing to worry about. But that's all right. We'll soon find out who came to Julia's house the day before. And with these words, the investigator hurried out of the house. Aurora, as soon as she was on the street, she sighed happily. She already realized that Frederick was not guilty. But now the woman also realized that the hardest thing to do was to prove Maria's guilt in Julia's poisoning. And in the fact that Maria was to blame, Aurora had no doubt. The woman soon arrived at the house where she had rented a room and sat down tiredly in a chair. Now she mentally hoped that she would succeed, and to do so she had to think of a ruse that would make Maria confess everything. Aurora realized that she only had one trump card, and that too still, which was like a soap bubble. The woman was hoping for a witness who was due to arrive tonight. Early the next day, the investigator went to Frederick's neighbor's house. She knocked on the door excitedly, because at the moment, she had a situation in the style of the popular saying, "Punt or lose." The woman was opened by an elderly man who looked like he had only recently woken up. The visitor apologized for such an early visit and introduced herself to the owner of the house. The man, whose name was Anthony, looked at the girl perplexedly and said, "Intrigued." And what my humble person interested the police officers. I seem to be friendly with the law and do not do anything unnecessary. Anthony, the thing is, I'm interested in September 24th. Do you remember that day? You mean the day Frederick's wife passed away? It's a pity about her. She was very friendly, but she's been talking to Elizabeth for nothing lately, for she's not very well. "Light here," said the man. "Now, I'm more interested in what you saw who visited Julia that day, and at what time approximately," Aurora said excitedly. "I remember, of course. I was fixing the car in the yard that day, just underneath it, and then Mickey the dog barked. I'm not nosy, but I wondered who was there, as I don't get visitors very often. And there was Maria, who works in the store on the edge of the village. I know her from when Mickey was married to her sister, Sarah, God rest her soul, who also died strangely," Anthony said. "Are you sure it was Maria?" the guest questioned tensely. "I may be of age, but my eyesight is one." "Why is that so important?" "They say it was Mickey who killed his wife. But you understand, it was because of that slutty Elizabeth," the man said. "You're talking nonsense. Now please answer one more question. Tell me, why do you think that Sarah, Frederick's first wife, died in a strange way?" Aurora said. "Well, it's just that all the locals know that that bridge is dying, and they try to use it only as a last resort. I'll say that in the most extreme cases, and especially if a person is a bit heavy. Sarah knew about it too, even though she had lived here for a relatively short time. Yes, I'm a gambling mushroom hunter myself, and I showed her our places. She is also a fan of quiet hunting. So I told her all about this bridge at once and took her word that she would not go this way," said the old man. "You have helped me a lot. Can you confirm that you saw Maria visiting Julia on September 24th? By the way, what time was that? And did you notice how long she stayed there?" The visitor said with the same excitement, "Yes, about 6 o'clock in the evening." "And she wasn't there long, for the dog barked again soon after, and I realized that Maria had gone out," Anthony replied. "Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We'll see you again soon," the woman said and walked briskly to her car. She now knew what she had to do. Aurora understood perfectly well that Maria could not be forced to confess to the crime, and there was no direct evidence, namely a vial of sedative. All the woman had at the moment was a witness that Maria had visited Julia before the poisoning, but it was not evidence, and so Aurora decided to get Maria's mother talking, and soon the investigator was sitting in Ariana's house. Aurora deliberately chose a moment when Maria was not at home. The guest looked at the old woman with a stare from which the old woman became uncomfortable, and she said, What brings you here again? I thought you had all your questions answered yesterday. Ariana, I understand that you love your daughter, but there are some circumstances I wish you could understand. The fact is that your daughter was once very fond of Frederick, who chose Sarah over her. You may deny it, but the fact is that Mary here has told me the same thing, and because of her feelings for the man, she has developed a hatred for her sister. Why are you telling me all this? Please remember where your daughter was when Sarah went for mushrooms, the guest said softly. Why are you asking me this? The old woman said nervously and then added, It was a long time ago and I do not want to remember it, as it brings me heartache. Don't you realize that your Sarah was not killed by accident? And I am asking questions purposefully, the visitor said stiffly. Are you implying that my Maria was involved in Sarah's death? Get out of my house and I don't want to see you here again, Ariana shouted. You can send me away. That's your right in this case, but understand that I'll be back here soon with other authorities. I blame Maria not only for the death of your daughter, but also for another tragedy that happened recently. And believe me, Maria is still in love with Frederick and could do a lot of other stupid things. I listened to the inconsolable widower's story in full. You should have listened to his story too, and maybe then you would have assessed the situation very differently. And I'm sure you know I'm right now. And before you kick me out, just remember the conversation we had yesterday in the kitchen, where Maria got nervous when I told her about the sedative and then accused you of being wrong. Aurora blurted out in one breath, looking at the older woman who had suddenly slumped. You're right. Her daughter still loves Frederick, and she hasn't even looked at another man. And I told her to look at the other guys who tried to court her. But she wouldn't. I'm ready to tell you about Maria, Ariana said in a muffled voice. Aurora sat with the old woman for at least 3 hours, listening to the old woman, who repeatedly began to cry during the story. The guest never interrupted the old woman because she knew that if she said a word to the old woman, she would immediately shut up and never say anything else. Aurora soon left Ariana's house, and it was hard on her heart because she had just listened to the confession of the old woman, and the story was as painful as the one she had heard from Frederick in her office. Aurora drove to Maria's workplace after visiting the pensioner, where she parked the car and waited for Sister Sarah's workday to end. The woman was in no hurry, as she realized that now everything depends only on how Maria will behave in the conversation and whether she will be able to give a confession. Time was slowly moving forward, and Aurora went over the scenario of the conversation several times, and each time she rejected it. Eventually, the woman grew tired and simply closed her eyes and thought about how nice it would be to take a bath or a warm shower that would calm her nervous system down a bit. After a while, Aurora saw Maria closing up store. She opened the car door and said a friendly hello to the woman who looked at her with distaste. Aurora invited Maria into the car for a chat. The woman approached and spoke with dislike. I've started to see you a lot and I don't enjoy it. I just want to have a heart talk, said the owner of the car and pressed the recorder with a discreet gesture. What else do you want to know? Let's make this our last conversation, Maria said. I won't promise that, but then let's agree that this time you won't lie and just confess everything. It will make you feel better. I'm not just saying this, but so that you realize that it is really true. I spoke to your mother recently, and Ariana told me a lot of things. About your love for Frederick that still exists, and about the medicine you took to Julia. I want my words to reach you now, Aurora said in a steady voice. You're a sly one, she smirked, and then said after a brief pause, It is true that I love Frederick, and that is my pain. All these years I only for him and recognized and every time tried to do everything to make him pay attention to me. But my chosen one never even let me near him. And how do you think I was not offended? Hurt, but maybe we should get to the story. I think that we will have a long conversation with you because you yourself said that all this time followed the fate of the beloved. And I understand that Frederick's wives went to the other world not of their own accord, said the investigator. Do you mean to say that all these women were lost because I had a hand in it? Don't make me out to be an outright criminal. There were some real simpletons among his other halves. My sister, I asked her to give up Frederick, but she wouldn't. I explained to her that they wouldn't be married for long. And I told Mickey about it, but neither of them listened to me. And then I couldn't bear to see the couple living happily ever after. And then Sarah went to go mushrooming. I followed her. I just wanted to scare her in the woods. And soon we came to that bridge, and I took her up on her weakness. I offered to walk across it. My sister didn't refuse. And when we came to a rotten board, I tapped it sharply with my foot. Sarah didn't keep her balance and started to fall. I could have reached out to her, but I didn't. Everybody thought it was an accident. And at that moment I started to look after Frederick after a while. But he just turned me down like an unwanted dog. And then I promised him that soon he would regret that he had refused me. After this revelation, Maria was silent. I understood about your sister earlier. But let's move on. After a while, Mickey remarried. And you showed yourself again, Aurora said in a muffled voice. I had no choice but to hear from my mother and other acquaintances that Frederick had married Barbara and was happily married. So I caught up with the woman and hit her from behind with a cobblestone. I didn't want her to die. I just wanted to hurt her. And Barbara died without regaining consciousness. It was a shock to me, Maria said indifferently. Aurora listened with horror to her companion as she spoke calmly about her crimes. What frightened her most of all was that Maria felt no remorse for her actions. The investigator offered to continue Maria's story further, and soon Aurora heard the continuation. About Frederick's third wife, I had nothing to do with that. Julianne was actually killed in an accident. She was hit by a car. I learned about it from her mother. So Julianne's death has nothing to do with me. Here I willingly believe you because during the investigation it was found that the fault of the drunk driver, who then received a sentence of imprisonment. Now let's move on to the fourth wife. This is Victoria. Frederick said that you were friends with her. Is that true? Aurora said. Maria thought for a moment and then easily said that Vika was a simple hysteric. And when they socialized, it was easy for Maria to frighten her that when she got pregnant, she would lose the child. Frederick's wife became visibly nervous after such conversations, and further she gave birth to a child who lived only a little. After these words, Maria looked at her interlocutor and thoughtfully said, Here too, it's not my fault that Victoria settled the score with her life, went and threw herself under the car. She did it on her own. I just told her to divorce her husband because he has bad karma, and this stupid took her own life. And tell me, what can I be accused of? Mentally pressuring a woman. Okay, let's not talk about that. Tell me about Julia. You're being honest now anyway, so please be honest here. Especially there's a witness who saw you visiting Julia that day, and also your mother's story. The investigator said softly. We had been talking to Julia for some time, and I knew that she couldn't get pregnant. I persuaded her to stay in the village. She agreed, but I thought I could mentally harass her by telling her that she would suffer the fate of her previous wives. But Julia was a hard nut to crack and just stopped talking to me. And then she became friends with Elizabeth. You've heard of her. I learned from Julia's friend that Frederick's wife was trying to find a way to get pregnant soon. That's when I hatched the plan to befriend Julia again, and then propose a miracle cure that promotes conception. Further, everything was made simple. I found on the internet where you can get poison, and soon I had this drug appeared. And then a bunch of apologies when I met Julia by chance and told her about the miracle cure, and she bought my story. Then, as I realize you already know, I just came in and poured this so-called elixir and didn't leave the vial behind. Why the need for evidence? I explained to Julia that it was only necessary to take it once, so I couldn't leave the vial with her, as others need this kind of help too. Don't you have any pity for these women? They didn't do anything bad to you. They just wanted to be happy, Aurora said in a muffled voice. I wanted to be happy too, but fate has somehow deprived me of it. You feel sorry for these women, but you don't feel sorry for me, Maria said harshly. Strange as it may seem, it is you who are not pitied, said the investigator, who was shocked by the story of her interlocutor. She could not understand why this pretty woman had so much anger and cruelty. After this conversation, Aurora took Maria home and did not say anything in farewell. She knew that tomorrow this woman will be arrested, and then the wheels of justice would turn, which would determine the degree of guilt of Ariana's daughter. Now, the woman wanted to talk to Frederick, and she went to his house without thinking. The man opened the door and looked at his guest with discouragement. Seeing that Mickey was not ready for her visit, Aurora said that she had news, but she did not agree to discuss it on the doorstep. The man invited the visitor with the words, "Something you frequent to me. Now I think that the visit was obligatory to you." And with these words, the woman handed the owner of the house a dictaphone. Frederick again looked at the guest in surprise, and she in turn offered to listen to the recording. The man immediately switched on the recorder, and at the first phrases he shuddered, as if he had been electrocuted. He involuntarily said, "That's Maria's voice." "That's right, but you listened silently from beginning to end. And I warn you, don't do anything stupid. Otherwise, I will have to use a few techniques that will calm you down for a while," Aurora said tiredly. Frederick sat down in the chair and listened. With each admission, the man's face grew more and more frowning, and his jaundices turned. As soon as the narration reached the last wife, then the owner of the house loudly shouted a curse, and then violently hit the table with his fist. And immediately afterward, he covered his face with his hands and wept silently. The guest remained silent and only watched the man's shoulders shudder. This went on for 15 minutes, and then Frederick raised his head and said in a hoarse voice, "What now? Will she get punished? Of course, don't worry about that. Now I can tell you that there was no mysticism in your life, and that what the so-called witch doctor told you was just a coincidence. By the way, I will add that all your sorrows are the fault of only one woman who loved with all her heart, and I condemn her, of course, for the crimes committed. But I can't blame her for loving you so much, because sometimes you can't command your heart," the guest said sadly. The man was stunned by what he had just learned. After all, he was considered a black widower in the village, but he learned the truth when he buried his fifth wife, and this news, which he listened to on the dictaphone, plunged him into a real shock. He could never have imagined that a woman in love is ready to go to such atrocities. When the first emotions of the owner of the house passed, he rushed to thank Aurora. The man incessantly told the investigator words of gratitude that if she had been involved, then most likely he would have been waiting for a prison sentence. The woman stopped the man with a tired gesture and said quietly, "It's my job to find criminals. Please don't thank me. The only thing I can say now is that there is no curse on you, and I hope that someday in the future you will be a happy man again. Let it happen neither tomorrow nor in a year, but it will definitely happen to you, and in this I sincerely believe. And now, can I have a cup of tea, because I'm quite tired after today." The next day, Aurora went to the police station to take Maria into custody. Then she was waiting for unpleasant news. It turns out that Maria, after coming home, then talked to her mother and found out that she will definitely be arrested tomorrow. And the woman wished her mother good night in her room and wrote a little note. "My beloved Frederick, only now I realize that I have brought you much pain in this life. I realized all this when I talked to my mother, and she cursed me. I have no one else in this world and nothing to live for. I know that you and I will never be together again, but I still hope that in heaven maybe you'll love me. I leave this life with the hope of meeting you in another dimension. And may my dream come true. I know you won't grieve for me, but please see my mom. It's not her fault. I think I've told you everything I wanted to tell you. Now goodbye and be happy. Maybe not now, but still. Always your Maria." After that, the woman changed her red dress, which she liked to wear on holidays. And then she closed the door to her room on the latch and took out that ill-fated vial of poison which she drank. In the morning, the door to Maria's room was broken in, where they found her breathless body and the empty vial lying next to her bed. For many fellow villagers who knew Maria, who left life by her own will, Maria's act was incomprehensible, but not to the police officer, Aurora, Ariana, and Frederick. They knew why Maria had done it. After the funeral, Aurora asked the man if he would fulfill Maria's last will. Frederick, without hesitation, replied that he would, and explained that the woman's mother was not guilty of anything, and he sincerely felt sorry for this old woman, who was left in this world all alone. Aurora, hearing the man's words, nodded approvingly and said, "I now understand why all your women were in love with you, but I will not decipher my answer. Let it remain a mystery. And now I wish you happiness and take care of yourself, and never again turn to magicians, witches, sorcerers, as they will not tell you anything good. Just rely on your intuition. Thank you again for everything. And thank you for your wishes. I will definitely listen to them. And I also ask you to come to our village once in a while. I would be glad to have you visit me anytime. As it seems to me lately, we have not become strangers after all. You pulled me out of the trouble. And now I do not consider myself a black widower, and what other people say I do not care," said Frederick with a smile. "I will definitely come because now I am also interested in your fate," said the interlocutor. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.